I am an ordained Presbyterian minister, and before coming to Chicago to work with the Parliament, I was the pastor of a small interracial church in a very poor community in Michigan. And I came to Chicago in 1992 to take a break and ended up working half-time to help organize the 1993 Parliament. I got my little Plymouth Colt and I drove to all these now diverse religious communities in metropolitan Chicago, inviting them to participate in the 1993 Parliament, and in the process also got my education about the world's religions. I had to wrestle with what does it mean to be a Christian in relation to people of other traditions. Do I have to give up my own particular tradition to be in interreligious work? Thankfully I found that was not the case. You know, there was a series of visits with Buddhists, with Jews, with Hindus, with Zoroastrians, Muslims, but there was a particular visit toward the end of my work, getting ready for the 93 Parliament, at the Sikh Gurdwara in a suburb in Chicago at Palatine. And I went there one Sunday morning, arriving about 9 o'clock to invite them to participate in the Parliament. I was asked to speak at their morning service and then invited to their sacred meal called Langar. Learned a great deal about Sikhism that day, and I remember leaving about 3 o'clock and something inside of me said, I'm going to be doing this work for the rest of my life. I think there was something about that day at the Sikh Gurdwara, something about Sikhism that helped with that. But it was the culmination of all my encounters with all the traditions of Chicago that I think brought me to that place. The paradox is that I'm a more deeply committed Christian because of my interaction with people of other traditions. And this is the paradox of the interreligious movement, that interreligious dialogue does not blur or make fuzzy or lukewarm one's own religious identity, while giving a person a greater appreciation of other traditions and learning from them. It also sharpens and deepens one's own sense of one's own religious commitments. For instance, in Islam, there is a strong link between justice and peace. Right now, I think some of the misunderstanding between the West and Islam has to do with this distinction. The West says to Islam, where are your voices speaking for peace? And Islam says back to the West, where are your voices speaking for justice? You can't say to the Muslim world, be at peace, if they're suffering under injustice. The West needs to hear that this call for justice will be accompanied by the value of peace. Now, as a Christian, as I learn of that connection, I have to go back to my own tradition and say, what role does justice play in my tradition? What does my tradition say about the best way to peace? It was on a trip to Israel, Palestine, I think it was in 2000 or 2001, that I came to a personal understanding of the meaning of hope. And I made a distinction between hope and optimism. Optimism has to do with what's going on out there. Are things going in a positive direction or a negative direction? What forces are at work? But hope has to do with how you decide to proceed. That whether things are going in a positive direction or a negative direction, what are you going to do about it? And I came to the conclusion that religions are only going to get along with each other if they're in dialogue. People of different traditions are only going to work together if they come to understand and respect each other. So, no matter how hard it is, no matter whether we're making significant progress or not, I don't see any other way. There's going to be no peace for Israelis if there isn't self-determination for Palestinians. And Palestinians, if they just devote all of their energy into battling Israel and not begin building their own nation, they're not going to have peace either. So the good news of the trip was, even though I was more pessimistic about were we going to ever get there, I didn't have to take sides. That ultimately what would work for one side was for the benefit of the other. And again, whether we're optimistic or pessimistic about that, only by working for the well-being of both peoples is there any hope. For the Parliament, we picked Australia because Australia is very intentional about multiculturalism and social cohesion. They have their issues just like any other country, but I think they've done a better job at welcoming people from around the world and are more intentional about helping to create understanding and harmony between different communities. Australia is really a leader in thinking about the environmental crisis. They're light years ahead of the US, Canada, and Europe in terms of addressing issues related to water, to the use of natural resources. So I think we have something to learn. You can't think of Australia without thinking of the plight of the Aboriginal people. And that really is the shadow side to Australian society. A big step was made last year when the Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, issued a formal apology to Aboriginal peoples. And because we're holding this in Australia now, we're inviting Indigenous peoples from 6 regions in the world to come, and we're devoting 60 of the 500 programs at the Parliament to listening to the concerns for self-determination from Aboriginal and Indigenous people. As I've gotten to know the Aboriginal situation in Australia and then learn more broadly about the plight of Indigenous peoples, I've come to see that we've treated Indigenous peoples the same way we've treated the earth. And I guess that's no surprise because they are the people closest to the earth. And as we think about looking at the way we treat the earth in new ways, I think there's a lot to be learned from Indigenous peoples, and that we also need to reconsider our relationship to them. And I hope that will be one of the enduring legacies of the Parliament in Melbourne. I will say more and more as I travel around the world, I'll meet somebody in a city who's working now to help religions talk and work together, who will say, I'm doing this because I went to the Parliament in Barcelona. I'm doing this because I went to the Parliament in South Africa. So visit our website, www.parliamentofreligions.org.